The screens went
Hey,
red
wait
at
up!
2:14 in the afternoon.
What is it?
Every
We need to talk.
authentication node across Apex Security Systems network began failing simultaneously, cascading, collapsing, folding into each other like dominoes. No one
Well,
had
this
seen
is it.
coming.
Take care of
14
yourself.
engineers
You too.
crowded the server room, voices rising over the hum of cooling fans. Nobody able to find the root file. Nobody understood the architecture well enough to even know where to look. Rebecca Hayes stood at the head of the war room, pulled up the original build log herself, and froze. Deep inside the core module, one author tag. 3 letters, JC_core auth. She cross-referenced the personnel database, hands moving fast, and a file opened. A photo loaded. She recognized the face immediately. The quiet man from the 12th floor kitchen. The one carrying a small cactus. The one she had watched walk out the door 6 days ago without a single person saying goodbye. Have you ever watched someone walk away and realize too late they were the only one who knew how to fix everything? It started 72 hours before the termination letter arrived on his desk. James Carter had been watching the system for weeks, not because anyone asked him to, not because it was written anywhere in his job description, but because he had built it. Every layer, every failsafe, every line of logic threaded through the authentication protocol that kept Apex Security running. He knew what it sounded like when something was beginning to come apart. There were signs, a latency spike at irregular intervals in the overnight logs, a handshake timeout in the secondary node that no one else would have caught unless they understood the architecture from the inside. James noticed. James always noticed. He wrote the report on a Tuesday evening after the floor had emptied out. Methodical, detailed, the kind of documentation that left nothing to interpretation. He had sent 3 previous versions to Richard Blake over the preceding 2 months, each one more urgent than the last, each one received in silence. This time he marked it urgent and added the head of IT to the carbon copy. He sent it at 11:47 at night and went home to his daughter. He did not know that 1 hour later, Richard Blake forwarded that same report to the IT team with James's name stripped from the header. The analysis appeared to come from Richard himself. James saw the forwarded email the next morning in the shared inbox. He stared at the screen. Then he closed the tab and went to make coffee. That was the morning he met Rebecca Hayes. She was 3 days into her role as CEO, and she moved through the 12th floor the way people move through spaces they have already memorized and are now testing against reality. James was in the small kitchen measuring out grounds when she appeared in the doorway. She looked at him the way people look at someone they assume belongs to a category they don't need to investigate. Which floor is the server room on Tom 11? Take the east elevator, the west one skips it. She nodded and was already turning to leave. Then she paused, just one beat, and looked back at him. He couldn't have said why. Neither could she. Then she was gone into the hallway and James poured his coffee and walked back to his desk. He sat down and opened his top drawer. Inside, folded into quarters, was a small piece of paper Emma had pressed into his hand the evening before. His daughter was 5 years old, and she carried a box of colored pencils, the way other children carried stuffed animals. She drew people, strangers mostly, and gave the drawings away without explaining why. Yesterday, she had drawn a man standing on top of a tall building holding a star. She had given it to James with the gravity of someone making a significant gift. He had put it in his drawer because he wanted it close. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about Emma. He thought about the permission slip on the refrigerator and the dentist appointment he needed to reschedule, and whether the school would require updated insurance forms if his coverage changed. He did not think about the report. He did not think about his name being removed from it. He folded the drawing, closed the drawer, and started his workday. But what nobody at Apex knew was that James came to work every day carrying more than just his laptop. The termination notice came the following morning, a single sheet of paper, 12 words, 8 years dissolved in one signature. He packed the small cactus he kept beside his monitor, nodded at the HR manager who stood in the doorway looking at somewhere above his left ear, and walked to the elevator. He crossed the lobby and pushed through the revolving door and stepped out into the gray November light of Chicago. He did not look back. He did not know that Rebecca Hayes was standing at the glass wall of the 12th floor at that exact moment, watching a quiet man carry a small box through the lobby and disappear into the street. She stood there a moment after he was gone. Then her assistant called her name, and she turned back toward the day. James got home at 11 in the morning. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments are quiet when you are in them at an hour you are not supposed to be. The refrigerator cycling, the building settling, the clock above the stove marking seconds with no obligation to stop. He had hated that clock since the month after Sarah died. It kept going while everything else had stopped, and he had never quite forgiven it. He set the cactus on the kitchen table. He sat on the floor with his back against the refrigerator and did not cry. He just sat. After a while he got up and opened the side table drawer and took out the envelope he had not looked at in months. Inside was the contract dated March of 2019. 4 pages. The compensation figure on the second page had seemed very large at the time. The author credit line was blank, under classification of services rendered consultant work for hire. He remembered the day he signed it. Sarah had been diagnosed 4 days earlier. The oncologist had explained the treatment protocol and the costs with the measured calm of someone who has delivered this kind of information before. The deposit required within 72 hours to begin the first treatment phase was a number James did not have: $47,000. He had called Richard from the hospital parking garage, sitting on the hood of his car in the cold. Richard had offered to buy the system outright. No conditions, no delays. The money in his account before the end of the week. All he needed was a signature. James had not read every line. He had needed Sarah to get into treatment before Friday. He signed. He returned the contract to its envelope and the envelope to the drawer. Then he went to the bedroom and took the old work phone from the nightstand battery dead untouched for a year and plugged it into the charger on Emma's dresser. He had never been able to reset that phone. Inside its camera roll were the last photographs Sarah had taken 3 days before she died at Northwestern Memorial, when afternoon light came through the hospital window at an angle that made everything in the room look gentler than it was. She was smiling in 2 of them. He could not bring himself to wipe the device. The emails on that phone, including one from Richard Blake, sent 2 years after the contract, which James had read and filed into the part of himself where things go that you know but are not ready to use, were simply there. A wound healed on the surface and not at all beneath. At 3:15 he walked to Emma's school. She came through the doors at full speed, backpack bouncing, pencil box clutched to her chest. She asked why he was early. He said it was like an early summer. She accepted this and took his hand. After dinner, while she colored at the kitchen table, James opened his laptop and searched for Rebecca Hayes, a Chicago Business Journal profile, and a LinkedIn page. A profile photo of a woman in a dark teal blazer standing before a large window looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who had decided something a long time ago and had not wavered since. Emma patted over in her socks and leaned against his arm. She studied the photograph with the focused attention she gave to all potential subjects. Then she went back to her pencil box without a word and began to draw. 20 minutes later she set the finished drawing in front of him. A woman with dark hair and a teal blazer standing before a window. She had the colors exactly right. She looks nice. It was not a question. James could not find a single thing to say. 4 days after James Carter cleared out his desk, Apex security systems collapsed. Not physically, not all at once. But the authentication system, every layer of it, every fail-safe, every handshake protocol began to behave exactly as James had warned in 4 separate emails over 2 months that it would behave if the latency issue went unaddressed. The log files began cycling in patterns that should not have been possible under normal conditions. The authentication timed out at increasing intervals, each cycle slightly worse than the one before it. The error rate climbing without pause toward a threshold that triggered automatic alerts across every department dashboard simultaneously. 14 engineers gathered in the server room and stood in front of screens that told them something was critically wrong without telling them anything about where to begin. The report that explained the failure in precise, actionable detail, James's report forwarded by Richard under a different name 2 months earlier, sat unread in the team's shared inbox because the person who had written it was no longer in the building, and without him there was no one who understood the architecture well enough to know which paragraph to read first. Richard Blake called an emergency meeting within the hour. He stood at the front of the conference room with the composure of a man who had rehearsed a version of this moment and believed his preparation had been adequate. He told the assembled department heads that the issue was contained, that his team had identified the root cause, and that full resolution was achievable within 48 hours. He used the word actionable. He used it twice. He did not mention the report. He did not mention the 4 emails. He answered questions from the room and kept his voice at the frequency of someone who is very certain and entirely unafraid. Rebecca sat at the head of the table and listened without expression. She let him finish. Then she asked a specific technical question about the error-handling logic in the authentication module. Richard answered with a generality. She asked about the cascade behavior in the secondary node and the expected propagation rate under current network load. Another generality delivered with slightly less confidence than the first. She asked who had originally designed the core system architecture. Richard said it had been an outside contractor, someone no longer in contact, one of those situations that arises during a company's early growth phase. She wrote something down in red ink while he answered. She set her pen down carefully on the table. She did not look up from the page for 3 full seconds. Richard Blake had been managing Upward for 17 years, and he understood the specific and dangerous language of extended silences. He watched her look at the page and felt something cold and deliberate move through him. I need the complete personnel record for everyone who worked on the core infrastructure between 2018 and 2022, and I need legal to pull every consulting contract from that same period. Frame it as a standard internal audit. She closed the notebook. Both on my desk before end of day. Richard said it seemed like a broad scope for an urgent situation. Rebecca said she appreciated his perspective. 2 hours later, the personnel list arrived on her desk. She went through every name on it twice. James Carter's name was not there. That night at 10 o'clock, Rebecca was alone on the 12th floor. The cleaning crew had come and gone. The hallway lights were down to their overnight setting, a dim institutional yellow that made the space feel suspended between a working building and an empty one. She pulled up the system's original repository, the complete version history going back to the first commit 7 years ago. She went to the root files. She went to the metadata. In the author field of the core authentication module, 3 characters blinked back at her from the screen JC_core auth. She opened a second window and went to the United States Patent and Trademark Office database. She entered the patent number she had found embedded in the system's original build documentation, placed there by someone who had wanted a permanent record and had no way of knowing that record would be buried under 6 years of other people's names. The result loaded without delay. Patent number 1124789-2B. Adaptive Layered Authentication Protocol. Filing date March of 2019. Inventor James Michael Carter. Licensee Apex Security Systems, LLC. She read the name twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she opened the personnel file and found his entry. The photograph loaded. The man from the 12th floor kitchen. The man who had told her to take the east elevator and smiled like it cost him nothing and gone back to his coffee. The man she had watched carry a cactus through the lobby 4 days ago while 30 people on that floor did not bother to look up from their screens. She sat with his photograph on her monitor and did not look away from it for a long time. In that time, she thought about what kind of person builds a thing and then watches other people take the credit for it and says nothing for 6 years. She called Richard Blake at 10:52 at night. One question. No preamble. Was James Carter the person who designed this system? There was a pause on the line, 1 beat longer than any honest hesitation would require. She ended the call. The pause had told her everything she needed. She sat in her car in the parking garage for a long time after that with her phone in her hand and the city humming somewhere above her through the concrete. She opened LinkedIn and found his profile. No photograph, no biography. Status currently taking time for what matters most. She read it once. She did not close the app immediately. She sat in the dark of the parking structure with the engine off and the windows beginning to fog at their edges, and thought about a man who had invented the system running her company, who had been quietly removed from his own work, who had sent 4 unanswered warnings that it was beginning to fail, and who had walked out of the building with a cactus and no parting words and apparently no intention of making anyone answer for any of it. She thought about the extra second she had spent at the kitchen doorway before turning the corner. She had not understood it then. She still did not entirely understand it now, but differently, as something that had a shape and a weight, even if she was not yet ready to give it a name out loud. Before she started the engine, she opened the personnel file one final time and looked at his photograph, not to confirm anything further. Everything had been confirmed. She just looked. Then she put the phone away and drove home through the November dark. The consulting contracts arrived the following morning in a bound folder from the legal department. Rebecca set everything else aside and turned directly to March of 2019. 4 pages, clean type, the Apex Security Systems header at the top. She read through the compensation clause, the scope of services, the intellectual property section. She stopped at the credit line. Author attribution not applicable. Classification of services rendered consultant work for hire. At the bottom of the 4th page was a residential address on the north side of Chicago. She tried the email listed beside it. The message bounced within seconds. She tried the phone number. Disconnected. He had cut his costs after losing the job. Of course he had. She closed the folder, stood up, took her jacket from the chair back, and walked toward the elevator. Richard intercepted her in the hallway. He had, she noted, positioned himself near enough to the elevator bank that the interception could not have been accidental. He said, with the practiced reasonableness of someone who had thought through every word in advance, that reaching out to a former employee whose contract had been legally terminated according to proper process could create unfavorable precedent, and that it might be advisable to consult with outside counsel before taking any further steps. He delivered it with the tone of professional concern. But his posture was a half-degree too deliberate, and his eyes were too steady in the way eyes get when a person is concentrating very hard on appearing at ease. Rebecca had spent enough years in rooms with people who had things to protect to know the difference between advice and management. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Thank you for your concern." She walked past him. In that moment, the unremarkable act of her continuing to move, Richard understood that he had made an error. A VP of engineering does not have a specific and urgent opinion about which former consultants a CEO chooses to contact unless he has a specific and urgent reason for wanting that person kept away. He had shown her the shape of what he was protecting. He stood in the hallway and watched the elevator doors close in front of him. The address was still current. James had not moved. He had stayed because Emma's school was 6 blocks away, because Sarah's mother lived nearby, and because it was the school Sarah had always said she wanted for their children back when she was still saying things like that. Rebecca drove north through the afternoon traffic parked on the side street, walked up to the front door of a building with a small concrete stoop and a potted plant beside the entrance that had managed against reasonable November odds to still be alive. She knocked. She waited. Movement inside. The unhurried approach of someone interrupted mid-task, who was coming without rushing. The door opened. They looked at each other across the threshold. A dish towel was tucked into his apron strings. He was holding a cast-iron pan. Behind him from the kitchen, the sound of a small person coloring. A moment passed between them, one of those moments that has a weight and a shape, but not yet a name. "I need to talk to you." He turned toward the kitchen. "Emma, go ahead and eat, sweetheart." They went out to the small landing at the top of the exterior stairs. The November wind off Lake Michigan was direct and cold. Rebecca had her hands in her jacket pockets. James leaned against the railing with his arms folded and waited. She asked him directly, with no preamble, why had he signed the contract the way he had signed it? Why had he left the author credit blank and said nothing for 6 years? He told her about Sarah, not the photographs, not the way the light had come through the hospital window on the last good afternoon, but enough. The diagnosis, the 72 hours, the parking garage, Richard picking up on the second ring with an offer and no conditions. "I needed her to get into treatment before Friday. That was the only fact I was working with." She listened without filling the silence. He went inside and returned with the old phone. He had been carrying it in his jacket pocket without fully understanding why, the way you carry things that have weight, you are not yet ready to put down." He unlocked it, opened the email, and held it out to her without explanation. She read it. Richard Blake, 2021, the year the system went fully live across the company. The message was 4 lines. Best not to bring any of this up with anyone. Everything's been handled. Let's keep focus on what matters now. She read it twice, then looked up. "You kept this for 5 years, and you never used it." "I kept the phone because of the photographs of Sarah. I couldn't reset it." A pause. "The email was just something that was there every time I opened it. Like something you know but don't want to carry around." She was quiet. There was nothing adequate to say, and she was perceptive enough not to try. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He turned to look through the kitchen window. Emma had finished eating and was at the counter now, pressing a drawing against the refrigerator door with a piece of taped tongue out the side of her mouth while she worked to get it straight. The drawing went up slightly crooked. She frowned at it, peeled it back, repositioned. It stepped away to assess. Satisfied, she went back to the table. "Because I was too busy being a dad to be a hero." He said it quietly, the way you say the facts that are the most true without emphasis, without performance. Rebecca looked where he was looking. She saw the drawing on the refrigerator. She saw the cactus on the kitchen table, the permission slip under a magnet near the door, the dish towel still hanging from his apron strings. She saw the whole shape of a life held together by a person who had decided at some specific moment of grief that the only thing worth holding on to was the small human who needed him to keep standing. Something in her shifted, not a professional recalibration, not a weighing of information. Something older than that and less manageable. The front door opened and Emma appeared with her pencil box and walked directly to Rebecca with the certainty of a child who has already made a decision and is simply executing it. She held out a folded piece of paper. Rebecca unfolded it carefully. The woman with dark hair, the teal blazer, the large window behind her. Emma had drawn this person 3 nights ago from her father's laptop screen and had been waiting with patient 5-year-old purpose for the chance to deliver it directly to its subject. "I drew you from the picture on Dad's computer." Rebecca looked at the drawing. She looked at James. He was looking at the railing, and his ears had gone slightly red. "She does this, draws strangers. I don't mind." Rebecca folded the drawing once carefully and placed it in the interior pocket of her jacket, the one on the left side nearest to where a person's heart would be if you were measuring. She drove back through the city with one hand on the wheel and the drawing folded against her chest. That night she compiled everything: the patent, the commit log, the contract, Richard's 2021 email. She sent it to the legal department with a cover note requesting an independent assessment of the 2019 agreement and all personnel decisions that had followed it. She sent the email, made tea, and sat by the window overlooking Lake Michigan. She had paid a decade of long days to be able to look out that window. Tonight the lake was dark and the city lights lay on its surface, and she could not stop thinking about a sentence she had heard on a back porch in November. At 2 minutes past 2 in the morning, her phone lit up. An email from a personal address. No subject line. She opened it. 8 pages of technical documentation, precise, exhaustive, organized with the clarity of someone who had been carrying this problem in his mind for a long time. The location of the system failure, the error in the secondary node, the cascade it was generating, the exact sequence of patches required in order of priority with estimated resolution times for each step. At the bottom of the last page below the final technical line was a single sentence of plain text. "Not for the board. Just because it needs to be fixed." She read that sentence 3 times. She set the phone face down on the table and looked out at the lake, large, dark, indifferent to the buildings along its edge. She thought about a man who had just been fired from the company he had built, who had been systematically removed from his own work, who had walked out with a cactus and no scene, and who had sat down at his kitchen table at some hour after his daughter fell asleep and spent the next several hours writing a document no one had asked for which he would not be compensated, addressed to the company that had let him go, because a system was broken, and the fact of its being broken was simply not something he could leave alone. There are people who do the right thing when someone is watching. There are people who do it when they have calculated, consciously or not, that it will eventually serve them. And then there are people who do it at 2 in the morning in an empty apartment with no audience and no expectation of anything in return, simply because the thing is broken and leaving it broken is not something they can live with. Rebecca had grown up believing she was that third kind of person. Somewhere in a decade of managed impressions and carefully calibrated presentations, she had lost track of whether it was still true or whether she had gradually become someone who only did the right thing when the context made it convenient. Tonight, sitting by the window with a cup of tea gone cold, she wanted to find out again. Before her calendar started the next morning, she opened his email and read the last line one more time. Then she put the phone in her pocket and walked into the building. Richard Blake had not spent the night waiting passively. 2 board members had received calls from him the previous evening, carefully framed calls suggesting that Rebecca was perhaps allowing emotion to distort her judgment and that her relative inexperience with the technology sector might warrant the board's attention. He had chosen the 2 members he assessed as most susceptible. He had been wrong about one of them. The head of legal called Rebecca at 8:15 to report the contacts. She thanked him, asked him to document everything, and told her assistant to schedule an emergency board meeting for 11 o'clock. At 10:45, before she walked into the boardroom, she took the phone from her pocket and opened his email one final time. She read the last line. Then she put the phone away, straightened her jacket, and walked in. She laid out the case without theatrics, the patent, the commit log with the JC_core author tag, the 2019 contract with the blank credit line. Richard's 2021 email projected on the screen at full size so that every person in the room could read it without assistance. The 4 unanswered warnings, each more urgent than the last, all sent before the crash, all forwarded to other recipients under a name that was not the name of the person who had written them. And then the last piece. She described the document that had arrived in her personal inbox at 2 in the morning. She read the final line aloud. Not for the board, just because it needs to be fixed, and let the room hold it in silence. 2 board members raised the legal defense as Richard had prepared them to. The contract was valid. The termination had followed proper process. There was no actionable breach. Rebecca did not contest the legal ground. You're right that it was legal. I'm asking whether it was right, and whether we are the kind of company that makes that distinction. She looked around the table. This man sent us a complete technical solution at 2 in the morning after we fired him. He wasn't asked. He won't be compensated. I want to know if this board is prepared to acknowledge what that means. The chairman asked whether it was possible to contact Mr. Carter. I've already been in contact with him. The question is whether we deserve to be. The vote was 6-1. Richard Blake was suspended pending internal investigation effective immediately. The 2 members he had lobbied cast abstentions. They could not bring themselves to vote in his favor after hearing that sentence read aloud by a woman who clearly understood exactly what it meant, but they were also not yet ready to fully account for what their years of incurious governance had quietly made possible. The investigation would begin within 48 hours. The room cleared without much conversation. That night alone on the 12th floor after cleaning crew left, Rebecca opened the system's original repository and found 3 letters that would change everything. CC. Rebecca drove to Emma's school that afternoon. She spotted James from across the street standing at the gate with a paper bag jacket, not quite heavy enough for November breath, making small clouds in the cold. He looked up when she crossed toward him. He did not look surprised, and she was glad of it. The board wants to meet with you. What for? To make it right. Before he could respond, the school doors opened and Emma came through at full speed, backpack swinging, pencil box pressed to her chest, and launched herself at her father with the total trust of a child who has never once been dropped. He caught her with one arm, the bag still in his other hand. Then Emma spotted Rebecca, and her face changed into the expression of someone who has been expecting a specific thing and is watching it arrive. "You're the lady from my drawing." Rebecca crouched to her level. "I am, and you draw very well." Emma received this as accurate, nodded once with the authority of someone confirming a fact they already knew, and tucked her face back against her father's shoulder. James stood there on the sidewalk with his daughter in his arms, and Rebecca in front of him. and the November wind cutting through all of them, and something in his chest that had been closed for a very long time began very carefully to open. When? Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Bring your old laptop. Bring everything. He nodded once. Emma lifted her head. Are you coming to dinner? Rebecca's eyes met James's. He said nothing. He was leaving the choice entirely to her. Not tonight, but maybe soon. Emma seemed satisfied with this and returned to coloring the air with plans for what she would draw next. Rebecca brushed the cold from her knees and walked back to her car. She did not look back until she reached the driver's side door. James was still standing there watching her. She raised one hand. He raised his. Then she got in and drove away. That night, James sat at the kitchen table after Emma had gone to bed and opened the laptop with the blue star sticker. He went through every file, the original design documents. The first commit March 14, 2019 timestamp 11:43 p.m., the night after he had signed the contract and 2 days before Sarah's first treatment. The full chain of technical correspondence during the development period, all of it meticulously saved because he had been trained as an engineer, and engineers keep records even when they do not yet know why. He had not brought it to make a case. The case had already been made. He brought it because the board would have questions, and the system was still broken, and he intended to answer precisely and fix what needed fixing. He sat in the glow of the screen and thought about walking back into that building. He thought about sitting across from people who had recently learned something about the company they governed that they had not previously known. He thought about Richard Blake's face when the door opened. Emma appeared in the hallway in her pajamas, one sock on, one sock off. Can't sleep. She shook her head and climbed into his lap without asking the way she always did. She looked at the screen. Is that the stuff you made? Yeah. Are you going to fix it? I'm going to try. She studied the code for a moment as if she could read it, which she could not, but she looked at it with the same focused attention she gave to everything she thought mattered. Miss Rebecca likes you. His hand stilled on the keyboard. What makes you say that? She looks at you the same way you look at her, like you're both trying to figure out if the other person is real. He had no answer for that. Emma nestled deeper into his chest. I think she's real, Dad. I think so, too. She yawned a wide 5-year-old yawn that showed all her teeth. Good. I already drew her into our family picture. She said it like a fact, like a thing already decided. And then she was asleep against him, breathing slow and even. James sat there with his daughter in his arms and the laptop glowing and the apartment quiet around them. He saved his work. He closed the screen. He carried Emma back to bed and tucked her in and stood in the doorway watching her sleep, this small human who saw things before they happened and drew them into being. The next morning he dressed in the one good shirt he owned, the blue one Emma said made his eyes look like the lake. He packed the laptop into his messenger bag. He made breakfast. He walked Emma to school. Her grandmother would pick her up at 3:30. He stood at the gate and watched her disappear into the building, this routine they had built together, the shape of their days. Then he turned and walked to the bus stop and rode south into the city. Apex Security Systems rose 30 floors above West Monroe Street, glass and steel catching the late morning sun. James had not been inside for 2 weeks. It felt longer. He pushed through the revolving door into the lobby. The security guard looked at his old badge. Sir, this badge is deactivated. I have a meeting with Ms. Hayes. The guard made a call, listened, nodded, handed James a temporary badge with visitor printed across it in red letters. James clipped it to his shirt and walked to the elevators. He pressed 12. The doors closed. The car rose. He watched the numbers climb and thought about the last time he had made this journey carrying a box with a cactus and a hoodie and 8 years of work reduced to things that would fit in his arms. The doors opened. Rebecca stood there. She was wearing the teal blazer from the photograph, the one Emma had gotten exactly right. Their eyes met and held. You came. You asked. She looked at the laptop bag. Your daughter's sticker. She has opinions about my aesthetic choices. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly, and James felt something shift in the air between them, some acknowledgement of the fact that they were about to walk into a room together and change the shape of what came next. They walked down the hallway side by side. She brought him to a small conference room outside the boardroom. He sat. He opened the laptop. He went through the files one more time, not rehearsing, just making certain of the details before he was asked about them. He was good at this. He had always been good at seeing the thing clearly and explaining it to people who needed to understand. At 10:15, the door to the boardroom opened. Rebecca appeared. "They're ready." He stood. He picked up the laptop. He followed her in. 7 people sat around a long table. He recognized 2 of them from company events, faces he had seen in passing, names he could not recall. They looked at him with the particular attention people give to someone who has become, overnight, a problem they need to solve. At the far end of the table, Richard Blake sat with his hands folded, posture rigid, jaw tight. James set the laptop on the table and opened it. He did not look at Richard. He looked at Rebecca. She nodded just once, and he understood the gesture. She had brought him here. She had made the space. But what happened next was his. Rebecca addressed the board. "Mr. Carter, I've asked you here to help the board understand what happened to our authentication system. But first I need to address something Mr. Blake just raised." She slid a folder across the table toward James. He opened it. 8 pages. Non-disclosure agreement. Signed March 2019. There was a section highlighted in yellow: employee agrees not to disclose any information regarding system architecture, design decisions, or development process to third parties, including but not limited to competitors, press, or regulatory bodies. James read it. He looked up. "Yes, I signed this." Richard leaned forward slightly, the posture of a man who believes he has just won something. Rebecca's voice cut through the room, clear and deliberate. "Can you also tell the board what you were doing when you signed it?" James was quiet for one beat. He could feel the room waiting. He thought about Sarah in the hospital bed. He thought about the oncologist's calm voice explaining numbers that meant life or death. He thought about sitting on the hood of his car in a parking garage with his phone in his hand and no other options. "My wife had been diagnosed with stage 3B lung cancer 4 days earlier. The deposit for her first treatment cycle was due in 48 hours. I didn't have the money. Mr. Blake offered to buy the system I'd built. Money in my account before end of week. I signed everything he put in front of me because the only thing I was thinking about was getting Sarah into treatment before Friday." He paused. "I would have signed anything." The room was completely silent. 2 board members looked down at the table. Richard did not move. The chairman, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a measured voice, spoke. "Mr. Blake, were you aware of Mr. Carter's circumstances when you presented this contract?" "I was aware he had a personal situation." "Yes. And you offered to purchase his work during that situation. It was a business transaction. He was free to decline." James opened a file on his laptop. He did not announce what he was doing. He simply connected the HDMI cable the assistant had placed on the table, and the screen behind him lit up with an email thread. March 2019. The first email appeared, from James to Richard, sent at 9:47 p.m. on March 11th. "Richard, Sarah's doctors say we need to start treatment by end of week. I'm $40,000 short. Is there any way to accelerate my Q2 bonus or get an advance on next year? I can pay back over 24 months. Please let me know." The second email. Richard's reply 6 hours later. "James, really sorry about Sarah. Company can't do advances, but I have another idea. You built that authentication system on your own time, right? Before you joined Apex full-time, I'd be interested in licensing it from you personally. Can get you $50,000 by Friday if you're willing to discuss. Let me know." The third email. James sent at 6:11 a.m. "Yes, willing to discuss anything. When can we meet?" The fourth email. Richard sent at 6:55 a.m. "Let's keep this simple. I'll have contract drawn up tonight. You sign tomorrow, money Friday. Clean and fast. Trust me, this is best path forward for everyone." The board stared at the screen. The chairman turned to Richard. "Mr. Blake, this shows you initiated the purchase offer specifically after learning about Mr. Carter's wife's condition. I saw an opportunity to help a colleague while also securing a valuable asset for the company. Win-win. You framed it as helping him. I did help him. James looked at Richard directly for the first time since entering the room. When he spoke, his voice was level, no anger in it, just the steady recitation of facts. You helped yourself to 6 years of credit for work you didn't do. You removed my name from every commit, every document, every presentation. When the system started failing exactly how I warned it would, you forwarded my reports under your name. When I was terminated, you told the board I was an outside contractor no longer in contact. You didn't help me. You bought my silence when I had no choice but to sell it. He turned back to the laptop. But none of that matters right now because the system is still broken, and if the board wants to sue me for breach of NDA after I fix it, that's your choice. But I'm not going to watch this company collapse because someone's too proud to admit they don't understand what they bought. He pulled up the technical documentation, the same files he had sent Rebecca at 2 in the morning. He walked them through it. The failure point in the secondary node, the origin in the latency issue he had flagged 4 times, the cascade it had produced, the specific sequence of patches required in order with explanations for why each step had to happen before the next. He was not performing. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply a person who understood something completely, explaining it to people who needed to understand it adequately. He spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. He showed code samples. He displayed the commit history with timestamps that proved he had written every line. He explained architectural decisions made 7 years ago that were still affecting system performance today. When he finished, he closed the laptop and sat back. The chairman spoke first. "We owe you an apology, Mr. Carter." James nodded once. He did not say it was all right. He did not perform gratitude. He had not come for the apology. The vote happened quickly. The chairman moved for immediate suspension of Richard Blake pending full internal investigation. The motion was seconded. The vote was 6-1 with 2 abstentions. The 2 members Richard had lobbied the night before could not bring themselves to vote in his favor after hearing the words, "I would have signed anything," spoken aloud by a man carrying a laptop with his daughter's sticker on it. But they were also not yet ready to fully reckon with what their years of looking the other way had allowed to happen. Richard stood. He did not look at anyone. He picked up his briefcase. He walked to the door. It closed behind him with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been. The room exhaled. The chairman turned to James. "Mr. Carter, the board would like to discuss terms for bringing you back in a consulting capacity. We understand if you need time to consider, but we'd appreciate the opportunity to make this right." James looked at Rebecca. She was watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something between hope and caution, as if she wanted him to say yes, but would understand if he said no. "I'll consider it, but I need to pick up my daughter at 3:30. "Of course. We'll be in touch." James stood. He put the laptop back in his bag. He walked out of the boardroom into the hallway. Rebecca followed him. She caught up to him near the elevators and held out an envelope. He took it. He opened it. He read every line slowly all the way to the last page. This time there was no 72-hour deadline pressing down on him from every direction. This time he could read carefully. Long-term consulting contract. His name in the author credit field. The patent number cited correctly. Compensation at double his last salary. A profit-sharing clause tied to system performance. A dedicated budget for a security research lab that James would name and run. "You didn't have to do this." "I know. That's why I did it." "Chan." He looked at her then directly and fully without the reflexive looking away he had practiced since Sarah died and solitude had become the structure around which he organized everything else. "Why not about the contract? About all of it?" She held his gaze. "Because there are things that are right, that need doing. You showed me that. At 2 in the morning. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. They stepped in together. The doors closed. In the brief, contained quiet of that small moving room, the building above and the city below, and nothing between them but 3 feet of space and the soft yellow overhead light, he said her name for the first time. Not Ms. Hayes. Not you. Just her name, the way you say something you have been thinking about for a while and are finally ready to say out loud. Thank you, Rebecca. She was looking straight ahead at the closed doors. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly, just enough for him to see if he was paying the kind of attention he was paying. He was paying attention. The doors opened on the ground floor. They stepped out into the lobby. The security guard nodded at them. James handed back the visitor badge. They walked through the revolving door into the November afternoon. The sky was the color of concrete. The wind had teeth. Rebecca pulled her coat tighter. Will you take it? The contract? I need to think about what's best for Emma. Of course. They stood on the sidewalk. People flowed around them. Chicago at midday, everyone moving with purpose toward somewhere else. James shifted the laptop bag on his shoulder. Can I ask you something? Yes. Why did you come to my house that first time? You could have just sent an email, made it official, kept it at a distance. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. The question had weight, and she was giving it the respect weight deserved. Because I needed to see if you were real, and I needed you to see that I was willing to show up. He nodded slowly, taking that in, understanding what it meant for a CEO to drive to the north side and knock on a door and stand on a cold porch, asking questions she already knew the answers to. I should go. Emma. Of course. She held out her hand. He took it. They shook formal and professional, but her hand was warm and she held on for just a beat longer than protocol required, and when she let go, he felt the absence of it. He walked to the bus stop. She walked to the parking garage. Neither of them looked back, though both of them wanted to. 6 weeks passed. Richard Blake resigned on a Wednesday morning without appeal 3 days after the internal investigation concluded its findings and presented them to the full board. He did not contest anything. There was nothing left to contest. The email chain had been clear. The patent record was public. The commit logs did not lie. He signed the papers and left the building, and no one saw him again. The authentication system was fully restored in 14 days, exactly as fast as the document sent at 2 in the morning had predicted. James's name appeared on Apex's technical documentation for the first time. The patent record was corrected to reflect the actual inventor. 300 people logged in every morning, and the system worked quietly and without interruption. The way things work when they have been built correctly by someone who understood what they were building. James signed the contract on a Friday afternoon in Rebecca's office. She poured him coffee, black, no sugar, the kind he had been making in the 12th floor kitchen the morning she walked in, and assumed he belonged to a category she didn't need to think about. She had remembered from a single brief observation the way she remembered things that mattered before she had words for why they mattered. He did not ask how she knew. He just drank the coffee and signed the papers and became for the second time in his life an employee of Apex Security Systems. Except this time his name was on everything. This time there were no blank lines. They shook hands across her desk. The city spread out behind her through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Michigan, a band of gray in the distance. I'll have an office set up for you by Monday. I'd rather work from home most days, if that's acceptable. Of course, whatever you need. He stood to leave. He got as far as the door before she spoke again. James. He turned. I'm glad you're back. So am I. It was the truth, and they both knew it, and there was nothing else that needed saying just then. December came to Chicago the way it always does, fast and cold and unforgiving. James rented a small office near the lakeshore, a 2-room space on the 3rd floor of an old building with radiators that clanked and windows that looked out over the water. He filled it with whiteboards and monitors and the kind of quiet that makes thinking possible. Emma came after school sometimes and did her homework at the table by the window, coloring in the margins of her math worksheets, inventing elaborate stories about the numbers. Rebecca came to the office on a Wednesday in the 2nd week of December. She brought coffee the same way she had brought it that first time, a gesture that had become a pattern. She sat across from him at the table. Outside Lake Michigan in December was a particular cold gray, not beautiful the way the lake is in summer, but not without its own austere and honest quality. They talked about the new system architecture he was designing. They talked about Emma, who had recently decided to draw exclusively in blue for reasons she had not yet articulated but seemed very certain about. They talked about Duluth, where Rebecca had grown up and not returned to since the August she turned 18, and drove south with everything she owned in a second-hand car with one working window. She had not told that story to anyone in a long time. James listened the way he listened to everything, without rushing to respond, without filling the available space with noise, without redirecting toward himself. He just listened. Rebecca found herself saying more than she had planned, and found that she did not want to stop. The December light moved slowly across the table between them. Neither of them reached for a lamp. When the light finally failed completely and the room went dark, except for the glow from the monitors, Rebecca looked at her watch. "I should go." "Probably." Neither of them moved. James leaned back in his chair. "Can I ask you something? You seem to be making a habit of that." He smiled, brief and genuine. "Why did you really push the investigation? Getting me back. You could have just fixed the system and moved on. You didn't owe me anything." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. The question was fair, and it deserved a real answer. "Because I spent 10 years learning how to run a company, and somewhere in there I forgot how to be the kind of person who does what's right just because it's right. You reminded me. And I didn't want to be the kind of CEO who sees that and then does nothing about it." She stood. She gathered her coat. She walked to the door and then stopped and turned back. "Also, Emma drew me into your family picture. I saw it on your refrigerator that first day. And I thought, if a 5-year-old thinks I belong somewhere, maybe I should pay attention." James stood. "She's usually right about these things." She drew her teacher 3 weeks before school started. She drew my mother-in-law before we met her. She draws what she sees before it happens. Rebecca absorbed the idea of a child who could see the shape of things before they took form. "What else has she drawn lately?" "You should probably come to dinner and find out." The words were out before he had fully decided to say them. They hung in the air between them. Rebecca's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, some small opening. "When?" "Sunday, if you're free." "I'm free." They stood looking at each other across the darkened office. The city lights beginning to come on outside the lake, invisible now, but still there, still holding its cold and honest space. 6 o'clock. "I'll be there." She left. He stood at the window and watched her cross the street to her car. She did not look back. He did not expect her to. He went back to his desk and tried to work, but found himself instead thinking about what it meant that he had just invited someone into the space he had been protecting for 3 years. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the morning she died and the promise he had made to her that he would take care of Emma and himself and not let grief turn them into ghosts. He thought about the fact that Sarah would have liked, Rebecca would have appreciated her directness, her refusal to pretend things were other than they were. He picked up his phone. He opened the photo app. He scrolled back to the hospital pictures, the ones he could never delete. Sarah smiling in the afternoon light. Sarah asleep with her hand over her heart. Sarah looking directly at the camera with eyes that knew exactly what was coming and had decided not to be afraid. He looked at the photos for a long time. Then he closed the app and put the phone away and went back to work. Sunday arrived clear and brutally cold. James spent the afternoon cooking Emma, helping in the way 5-year-olds help, which is to say, creating more work, while absolutely convinced she is being useful. She set the table with exaggerated care, folding napkins into shapes that approximated swans arranging silverware with the precision of someone defusing a bomb. "Is Miss Rebecca really coming?" "Yes." "Good. I made her something." She held up a drawing, this one in blues and greens, a woman and a man and a small girl standing at the edge of water under a sky full of stars. "That's beautiful." "I know." She said it without arrogance, just fact. James looked at the drawing and felt something in his chest crack open a little wider. Emma had drawn them as a unit, 3 figures together, and she had done it without asking permission, without checking if it was allowed. She had simply seen it and made it real. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. Emma sprinted to the door and flung it open before James could stop her. Rebecca stood on the threshold with a bottle of wine and a small wrapped package. She looked at Emma and then passed her to James, and something in her face relaxed some tension he had not realized she was carrying. "Hi." "Hi." Emma took her hand and pulled her inside. Rebecca let herself be pulled. James took her coat. Emma dragged her to the kitchen to show her the table settings. Rebecca admired them with appropriate gravity. Emma handed her the drawing. "I made this for you." Rebecca unfolded it carefully. She looked at it for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "Can I keep this? That's why I made it." They ate dinner at the small table by the window. Emma talked non-stop about her day. Her teacher, the boy in her class who ate glue, the substitute music teacher who didn't know how to tune a guitar. James and Rebecca listened and responded and looked at each other over Emma's head with the shared understanding of adults watching a child be gloriously, unself-consciously herself. After dinner, Emma presented Rebecca with a tour of the apartment, pointing out significant landmarks: the chair where Dad reads, the spot on the ceiling that looks like a dog, the window where you can see the moon if you stand on your toes. Rebecca followed along, asking questions, taking it all seriously. They ended in Emma's room where the walls were covered in drawings, a gallery of faces and places and things Emma had seen or imagined or predicted. Rebecca stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. Emma climbed onto her bed. "Do you like them?" "I think they're remarkable. Dad says I see things before they happen." "Do you?" Emma considered this. "I just draw what I see. If it happens later, that's not really my fault." Rebecca laughed a real laugh, unguarded and surprised. James stood in the doorway watching them and felt the last careful wall around his heart begin to crumble. This was dangerous. This was terrifying. This was a woman he barely knew, standing in his daughter's room laughing at something Emma said, and it felt more right than anything had felt in 3 years. Emma yawned, huge and sudden. Rebecca checked her watch. "I should go. Let you get to bed." "You could stay." The words were simple, direct, the way children say things before they learn to be careful. "Maybe next time." "Promise." "Promise." Emma seemed satisfied with this. Rebecca bent down and Emma hugged her, fierce and quick, then released her and burrowed under her covers. James walked Rebecca to the door. They stood in the hallway, coats on the apartment quiet behind them. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for asking." "Emma likes you." "I like her. She's extraordinary." "She is." They looked at each other. Rebecca's hand was on the doorknob, but she was not turning it. "James?" "Yeah. I'd like to do this again." "So would I." She opened the door. Cold air rushed in. She stepped out onto the landing, then turned back. "How many people do we walk past every day who are carrying more than we'll ever see?" He understood what she was asking. It was not really a question. It was an acknowledgement. Most of them, probably. And how often do we judge someone's silence as indifference when it's actually dignity, more than we should? She nodded slowly, as if he had confirmed something she already knew but needed to hear said aloud. "When we finally see the truth, are we brave enough to make it right?" "You were. We were." She said it firmly, a correction, an insistence on shared credit. Then she smiled small and private and walked down the stairs into the December night. James stood in the doorway until her car disappeared around the corner. Then he went back inside and found Emma sitting on the couch with her drawing pad, already working on something new. "What are you drawing?" She held it up. 3 figures at a table. A 4th figure approaching, hand raised in greeting. The edges were still rough, but the intention was clear. "Is that Grandma?" "Maybe. Or maybe someone else. I'm not sure yet." James sat beside her. She leaned into him, pencil still moving across the page, adding details only she could see. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Are you happy?" The question landed with unexpected weight. He thought about it carefully, wanting to give her a true answer. "I'm getting there." "Good. You should be happy." Mom would want you to be happy. She said it simply, a child's logic unencumbered by adult complications. And she was right. Sarah would have wanted that. Sarah had made him promise in one of their last conversations that he would not stop living just because she had to. "You're pretty smart, you know that." "I know." She went back to her drawing. James watched her work, this small person who saw the world in ways he could not, who drew the future into being one colored pencil line at a time. On the refrigerator, held by a moon-shaped magnet between a school calendar and a photograph of Sarah taken in summer light 10 years ago, Emma's earlier drawing remained. The woman in the teal blazer, the dark hair, the forward gaze, and at the bottom, written in the large, uneven letters of a child still learning that lines don't have to be perfect to say exactly what you mean in red pencil, Miss Rebecca the lady Dad looks at. Every morning before he made coffee, James looked at that drawing. Every morning he thought about whether there was a good reason to be on the north side of the city that day. There usually was. And on the days there wasn't, he made one. Winter deepened over Chicago, and James fell into a rhythm he had not known he was capable of finding again. 3 days a week he worked from the lakeshore office, the radiators clanking their irregular percussion while he rebuilt security protocols that had been held together with patches and hope. 2 days a week he worked from home, Emma doing homework at the kitchen table while he answered emails and reviewed code on the laptop with the blue star sticker. The system ran clean. The error logs stayed quiet. People across the company logged in and out without ever knowing his name, which was exactly how he preferred it. Rebecca came by the office most Wednesdays. She always brought coffee. She never announced herself, just appeared in the doorway with 2 cups and a question about architecture or encryption or whether he had seen the latest proposal from the infrastructure team. They would talk for an hour, sometimes 2, the conversation moving easily between technical details and personal corners. The kind of exchange that happens between people who are learning to trust each other in increments. On the 3rd Wednesday in January, she arrived later than usual, closer to 5 than 3, and when she came through the door, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. Bad day. Board meeting ran long. They want to accelerate the expansion into healthcare security. Double the timeline, same budget. She dropped into the chair across from him and closed her eyes. Tell them no. I can't just tell the board no. Sure you can. You're the CEO. That's not how it works. Then maybe it should be. She opened her eyes and looked at him, something shifting in her expression, a reassessment happening in real time. You really believe that? I really do. You brought me back because you thought it was right, even though it was complicated. You can tell them no because it's the smart decision, even though it's unpopular. She sat with that for a moment, turning it over, testing its weight. What would you do? I'd tell them the truth. That rushing infrastructure puts user data at risk, that no amount of revenue is worth a breach, and that if they want it done fast and cheap and secure, they can pick 2. The corner of her mouth lifted. That's almost word for word what I wanted to say. So say it. Just like that. Just like that. She pulled out her phone, typed something quickly, and hit send. Then she set the phone face down on the table. Done. I told them we'd do it right or not at all. And if they push back, then they push back, but at least I'll be able to sleep. They sat in comfortable silence while the light outside faded and the office grew dark around them. James reached over and turned on the desk lamp. The warm glow pushed the shadows back to the corners. Rebecca picked up her coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup. Can I tell you something? Always. When I took this job, I thought I knew what kind of leader I wanted to be. Decisive, strategic, someone who made hard calls and moved on. But I'm starting to think I confused being decisive with being right and being strategic with being certain. You don't do that. You just look at what's true and say it out loud and let other people catch up. That's not a superpower. That's just being too tired to pretend. She laughed short and surprised. Maybe that's what I need to be. Too tired to pretend. It's surprisingly freeing. She finished her coffee and stood to leave, then paused halfway to the door. James. Yeah. Would you want to get dinner sometime? Not here. Not a meeting. Just dinner. The question hung in the air between them, careful and deliberate. He could feel the weight of it, the invitation to step across a line they had both been aware of, but neither had named. "I'd like that. This weekend, Emma's with her grandmother Saturday night." Saturday, then. She left before he could second-guess the decision, before either of them could make it complicated. He sat alone in the darkened office and thought about what it meant to say yes to something that was not about Emma, not about work, not about anything except the fact that he wanted to spend time with a woman who brought him coffee and asked hard questions and looked at him like he was someone worth knowing. Saturday arrived cold and clear. James dropped Emma at her grandmother's house in the early afternoon. Sarah's mother met them at the door, her face lighting up when she saw her granddaughter. She had aged in the 3 years since Sarah died, her hair gone fully silver, new lines around her eyes, but she held Emma with the same fierce tenderness she had always shown. "We're going to make cookies and watch movies and stay up too late." Emma looked at her father for confirmation that this plan was acceptable. He nodded. She hugged him goodbye and disappeared into the house without a backward glance, already listing ingredients she thought should go into the cookies. Sarah's mother touched his arm. "You look good, James. Better than you have in a long time." "I'm doing okay." Sarah would be glad. The words landed gentle but firm, a benediction he had not known he needed. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and walked back to his car. He drove home through the winter afternoon and thought about the fact that Sarah's mother had given him permission to move forward, even though he had not asked for it. He met Rebecca at a small Italian place in Wicker Park, the kind of restaurant that had been there for 30 years and would probably be there for 30 more. She was already seated when he arrived, wearing jeans and a gray sweater, her hair down instead of pulled back. She looked younger this way, less guarded, more like someone who had decided to let the evening be what it was without managing it. They ordered wine. They talked about Emma's cookie-making plans and Rebecca's disastrous attempt to cook Thanksgiving dinner for herself the previous year. They talked about Chicago winters and whether the lake ever really froze all the way across, and what it was like to grow up in Duluth with a father who worked on the ore ships and a mother who cleaned houses and a burning certainty that she had to get out or she would disappear. James listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything, just holding space for the story she was trusting him with. When she finished, she sat back and looked at him with something close to relief. "I've never told anyone that. Not the whole thing." "Why now?" "Because you don't need me to be anyone other than who I am, and I'm tired of keeping track of which version of myself I'm supposed to be in which room." "I know that exhaustion. I think you do." The waiter brought their food. They ate slowly, the conversation shifting to easier topics, the rhythm of it, comfortable in a way that suggested practice neither of them had actually gotten. Somewhere around dessert, Rebecca's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her face went tight. "What is it?" "Richard Blake filed a lawsuit this afternoon. Breach of contract, wrongful termination, defamation. He's going after the company and naming me personally." James set down his fork. "Can he win?" "I don't know. His lawyer is arguing that the investigation was biased, that I had a personal relationship with you that clouded my judgment, that the board acted without due process." "Do you have a personal relationship with me?" The question was direct, unavoidable. Rebecca met his eyes. "I'm sitting across from you at dinner on a Saturday night. So yes, I suppose I do." Then his lawyer has a point. "Are you saying I shouldn't have pushed the investigation?" "I'm saying you did the right thing and now you're going to pay for it. That's usually how it works." She pushed her plate away. "I'm not sorry I did it. I know. Even if it costs me everything. I know that too." She pulled out her phone again, opened her email, started typing. He watched her compose the message, her face set in concentration. When she finished, she showed him the screen. It was addressed to the board. "Mr. Blake has filed suit alleging improper conduct. I want you to know that I stand by every decision made during the investigation. If the board feels my judgment was compromised, I will resign effective immediately. But I will not apologize for doing what was right." "Don't send that yet." "Why not?" "Because you're angry, and you're scared, and neither of those is a good place to make permanent decisions from. Sleep on it. If you still want to send it tomorrow, send it. But don't do it tonight." She stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the send button. Then she deleted the draft and put the phone away. "You're right. Tomorrow. Tomorrow." They split the check. They walked out into the January cold. The sidewalk was icy, and Rebecca's heel caught on a rough patch. James reached out instinctively to steady her. His hand found her elbow. She steadied herself but did not pull away. They stood there in the cold with his hand on her arm, and her breath making small clouds in the air, and the city moving around them indifferent and vast. "Thank you." "For what?" "For talking me off the ledge. That's what friends do." "Is that what we are, friends?" He let go of her arm but did not step back. "I think we might be something more than that, if you want to be." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that sees everything and decides anyway. "I do." "Then we will be." She smiled small and private, and they walked to their cars in silence that felt less like an ending than a beginning. The lawsuit became public knowledge the following Monday. By Tuesday it was all over the tech news sites, Richard Blake's version of events competing with Apex's carefully worded statement about standing behind its personnel decisions. By Wednesday the board had called an emergency meeting to discuss liability and exposure and whether Rebecca's position was tenable given the circumstances. James found out about the meeting from Rebecca's assistant, who called him directly because Rebecca had asked her to. "She wanted you to know, in case it matters." "It matters." He hung up and looked at the clock. The meeting started in 40 minutes. He could be there in 30 if traffic cooperated. He grabbed his coat and his laptop and walked out of the office without locking the door behind him. He made it to Apex headquarters with 5 minutes to spare. The security guard recognized him now and waved him through without checking his credentials. He took the elevator to 12 and walked straight to the boardroom. Rebecca's assistant saw him coming and opened the door without being asked. The room went silent when he entered. 7 board members turned to look at him. Rebecca sat at the head of the table, her face carefully neutral. The chairman, a man named Douglas Chen, who had been pleasant but distant during James's previous appearance, stood. "Mr. Carter, this is a closed meeting." "I know, but if you're discussing whether Rebecca made the right call bringing me back, I should probably be here to answer questions." "That's not what we're discussing." "Then what are you discussing?" Douglas hesitated. Rebecca spoke before he could answer. "They're discussing whether I should step aside while the lawsuit proceeds, to protect the company's reputation." James looked around the table. "And what have you decided?" "We haven't decided anything yet." "Then let me make this simple. Rebecca Hayes did her job. She found evidence of fraud and she reported it to the board, and the board acted on it. That's not improper conduct. That's exactly what a CEO is supposed to do. If you force her out because Richard Blake filed a lawsuit, you're telling every other employee in this company that integrity is negotiable and documentation doesn't matter. Is that the message you want to send?" One of the board members, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and sharper questions, leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Blake's complaint alleges that Ms. Hayes's judgment was influenced by a personal relationship with you. Can you speak to that?" "Yes. Rebecca and I are friends. We have dinner sometimes. She comes by my office to talk about work." "If that constitutes a personal relationship, then yes, we have one. But that relationship started after the investigation concluded, not before. And even if it had started before, it wouldn't change the facts. I built the system. Richard bought it under duress. He removed my name from the work. Those things are all documented and provable. They don't become less true because Rebecca and I get along." The sharp-eyed woman sat back, apparently satisfied. Douglas looked less certain. "Mr. Carter, I appreciate your perspective, but this is ultimately a board matter." "Then handle it like a board matter. Look at the evidence. Make a decision based on what's true, not what's convenient. And if you decide Rebecca should step aside, do it because you genuinely believe that's the right call, not because you're afraid of bad press." He turned to leave. Rebecca stood. "James?" He stopped, but did not turn around. "Thank you. You did the same for me." He walked out. The door closed behind him. He went back to the elevator and rode down to the lobby and stepped out into the winter afternoon feeling like he had just burned a bridge he might need later. His phone buzzed before he reached his car. A text from Rebecca. "They voted to keep me on, 6-1. Same people, same vote. You didn't have to do that." He typed back quickly. "Yes, I did." Her response came immediately. "Dinner tonight." He smiled at the screen. "Your place or mine?" "Yours. Emma should be there." He drove home thinking about what it meant that Rebecca wanted to have dinner at his apartment with his daughter present, that she was choosing to step into the full, complicated reality of his life rather than keeping things contained and separate. He stopped at the grocery store and bought ingredients for pasta and salad and the kind of bread Emma liked. He cleaned the apartment with more care than usual, not because he was ashamed of how it looked, but because he wanted it to feel welcoming. Emma came home at 4, full of stories about cookies and movies and the fort she had built in Grandma's living room. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw him chopping vegetables. "Is Miss Rebecca coming over?" "How did you know?" "You only make the good pasta when someone's coming." She was right. He had been making the good pasta, the kind with fresh tomatoes and basil and garlic that took actual effort. He had not even realized he was doing it. "Yes, she's coming for dinner." Emma's face split into a grin that could have powered the entire city. "I need to change." "You look fine." "I need to change." She disappeared into her room and emerged 10 minutes later wearing her favorite blue dress, the one with the stars on it that Sarah had bought for her 4th birthday. She had brushed her hair and put on the sparkly shoes that were technically too small, but that she refused to give up. She looked at him expectantly. "How do I look?" "Beautiful." "Good, because Miss Rebecca is going to be part of our family and I want to look nice." The certainty in her voice, the absolute lack of doubt, hit him square in the chest. He knelt down to her level. "Emma, you know that's not something we can just decide, right? Miss Rebecca has her own life. She might not want to be part of ours." "She wants to. I drew it already, and my drawings come true." She said it with the unshakable confidence of a child who has seen her predictions manifest enough times to believe in her own accuracy. James wanted to tell her that life was more complicated than colored pencils and paper, that people were unpredictable, that wanting something was not the same as having it. But he also knew that Emma saw things he could not, that she had drawn Rebecca before Rebecca arrived, that she had a gift he did not understand and could not explain. "Okay, but let's not tell Miss Rebecca that yet. Let's just have dinner and see what happens." "Okay, but it's going to happen. If you say so." "I do say so." Rebecca arrived at 6:30 with a bottle of wine and a children's book about a girl who could paint the future. She handed the book to Emma, who accepted it with appropriate solemnity and immediately sat down to read it. Rebecca looked at James over Emma's head, a question in her eyes, too much. He shook his head slightly. "Just right." They ate dinner at the small table by the window, the three of them crowded together in a space meant for 2 elbows, bumping conversation flowing in easy spirals. Emma monopolized the conversation, telling Rebecca about the fort she had built and the cookies she had made and the movie she had watched that had a dog in it who could talk, but only to the little girl. "Do you think animals can really talk to some people?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. "I think some people are better at listening than others. Maybe the animals talk to everyone, but only certain people can hear them." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer. She turned to her father. "Dad's good at listening." "He is. Are you good at listening?" "I'm trying to be." "You should try harder. It's important." Rebecca's eyes went bright with suppressed laughter. James concentrated very hard on his pasta. After dinner, Emma insisted on showing Rebecca her latest drawings, including the one she had made the previous week of 3 figures at a table with a 4th approaching. The 4th figure was clearer now, more defined. It was a woman with dark hair. "Is this me?" "Maybe. I'm not totally sure yet, but probably." "I like how you draw people. You make them look happy even when they're doing normal things." "That's because I only draw people who are supposed to be happy." "And you think we're supposed to be happy?" Emma looked at her father, then back at Rebecca, then down at her drawing. "I think you're trying. That's close enough." Rebecca crouched down to Emma's level. "You're very wise, you know that. Lots of people tell me that." "I bet they do." Emma yawned, sudden and huge. It was past her bedtime and the day was catching up to her. Rebecca stood. "I should let you get to bed. Can you read me my new book first?" Rebecca looked at James. He nodded. Emma took Rebecca's hand and pulled her to the bedroom. James cleaned up the kitchen and listened to the murmur of Rebecca's voice reading about a girl who painted tomorrow on canvas and made it real. When the story ended, there was quiet. Then the sound of Rebecca's footsteps in the hallway. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. "She's asleep." That was fast. I think she was more tired than she wanted to admit. They stood in the kitchen with the dinner dishes drying on the rack and the apartment settling into its nighttime sounds. Rebecca leaned against the counter. She asked me if I was going to be her new mom. James felt his chest tighten. "What did you say?" "I said that I wasn't trying to replace anyone, but that I cared about her very much and I cared about her dad very much, and that sometimes families grow in unexpected ways." "And what did she say to that?" "She said that was a very good answer and that I passed the test." "She was testing you, apparently." James crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her close enough that he could see the amber flecks in her eyes, close enough that the space between them felt like a question waiting to be answered. "And how do you feel about that? About her thinking of you that way? Terrified, honored, completely unprepared, all of the above?" "That's fair. How do you feel about it?" He took a breath. This was the moment. This was the step across the line that could not be taken back. "I think I'm falling in love with you. And I think Emma already has. And I think that's either the best thing that's happened to us in 3 years or the thing that's going to hurt the most when it falls apart." Rebecca reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "What if it doesn't fall apart?" "What if it does? Then we'll hurt, and we'll heal, and we'll be glad we tried. But I don't think it's going to fall apart, James. I think we're both too stubborn and too careful and too aware of what we're building to let that happen." He covered her hand with his, holding it against his face. "I haven't done this in a long time." "Neither have I. I'm going to be bad at it." "So will I. Emma comes first, always." "I know. I wouldn't want it any other way." He kissed her then, soft and careful, a question and an answer all at once. She kissed him back, her hand sliding from his cheek to the back of his neck, pulling him closer. They stood in his kitchen, kissing like teenagers, clumsy and earnest, and absolutely certain that this was the right kind of mistake to make. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Rebecca rested her forehead against his. "I should go. You could stay. Not yet. Soon, but not yet." "Okay." He walked her to the door. She put on her coat and her shoes and stood on the threshold looking back at him. "James?" "Yeah. Thank you for letting me in. Thank you for showing up." She left and he stood in the doorway until her car disappeared the same way he had stood there before, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like a beginning instead of an ending. Spring came slowly to Chicago, reluctant and interrupted cold days punctuated by warm afternoons that promised something better just ahead. The lawsuit dragged on through March and into April, depositions and motions and endless meetings with lawyers who billed by the quarter hour. Rebecca handled it with the same steady determination she brought to everything, refusing to be distracted, refusing to let Richard Blake's final act of spite derail the work she had fought to protect. In early May, the case settled. Richard dropped the personal claims in exchange for a confidential financial agreement and an NDA that prevented both parties from discussing the details. Rebecca called James from her office the afternoon the papers were signed. "It's done. How do you feel?" "Tired, relieved, ready to move on." "Come to dinner tonight. I have a better idea. Come to my place. I'll cook." He had never been to her apartment. She had kept that space separate, private, a boundary that marked the difference between her work life and everything else. The invitation felt significant. "What time?" 7. He picked up Emma from school and explained that they were going to Rebecca's place for dinner. Emma received this information as proof that her drawings were continuing their perfect accuracy rate and spent the entire drive asking questions about what Rebecca's apartment looked like and whether she had any pets and if there would be dessert. Rebecca's building was in Streeterville, a high-rise with a doorman and an elevator that required a key card. Her apartment was on the 23rd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake, minimalist furniture that looked expensive and uncomfortable. But there were books everywhere, stacked on tables and shelves and the floor, and a blanket thrown over the back of the couch that looked well used, and paintings on the walls that were strange and beautiful and clearly chosen by someone who cared more about what they meant than what they cost. Emma went straight to the windows and pressed her face against the glass. "You can see forever." "Almost." "Do you watch the boats?" "Sometimes. In the summer when there are boats to watch." James stood in the center of the room, taking it all in this space Rebecca had built for herself, this life she had made before he and Emma arrived. It was beautiful and lonely, and he understood with sudden clarity how much courage it had taken for her to let them in. They ate dinner at the small table by the window, pasta again, because it was the thing they all agreed on: conversation, easy and familiar. After dinner, Emma asked if she could draw, and Rebecca produced a sketchbook and colored pencils that looked brand new. Emma settled onto the floor and began to work while James helped Rebecca clean up. They stood at the sink washing dishes, shoulders touching, moving in the comfortable rhythm of people who had learned each other's patterns. Rebecca handed him a plate to dry. "I'm glad you're here." "So am I. I mean really here, in my space. It feels right." "It does." She set down the plate she was washing and turned to face him, her hands still wet, soap bubbles sliding down her wrists. "I want you to know something. I'm not trying to replace Sarah. I'm not trying to make Emma forget her mother. I know I can't be that, and I don't want to be that. I know. But I also want you to know that I'm all in. Whatever this is, however it grows, I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to go." He dried his hands and pulled her close, his arms around her waist, her head tucked under his chin. "I'm not going to tell you to go." "Good." They stood there holding each other while Emma drew at their feet, and the city lights came on outside, and the lake went dark and vast beyond the glass. James thought about Sarah, about the promise he had made to keep living, about the fact that loving Rebecca was not a betrayal, but a fulfillment of that promise. He thought about Emma's drawings, and whether the future was fixed or fluid, whether his daughter drew what was coming or drew it into being. He thought about the fact that he was standing in Rebecca's apartment with his daughter on the floor, and his arms around a woman who had fought for him when he could not fight for himself, and that this unlikely constellation of circumstances had somehow become his life. Emma held up her drawing. "Finished." Rebecca and James separated and looked at what she had made. 4 figures now clearly defined. A man and a woman and a small girl and another woman fainter standing behind them with her hand on the man's shoulder. Sarah. Emma had drawn Sarah into the picture, not replacing her, not erasing her, but including her as part of what they were becoming. Rebecca's breath caught. James knelt down beside his daughter. "Is that Mom?" "Yeah. She wanted to be in the picture, so I put her in." "How did you know she wanted to be in the picture?" Emma looked at him with the patience of a child explaining something obvious to a slow adult. "Because she's always watching, and she wants you to be happy, so she asked me to draw her watching you be happy." James could not speak. Rebecca knelt beside them, her hand on his back. "Can I keep this one too?" Emma nodded and handed it to her. Rebecca held it carefully, like it might dissolve if she gripped too hard. "Thank you. This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." "You're welcome. You can hang it in your office so everyone knows you have a family." The word hung in the air, simple and enormous. Family. Emma had named them, that had drawn them into being, had decided that this was what they were and would become. Rebecca looked at James. He looked back. Neither of them corrected her. They left an hour later, Emma asleep in James's arms, exhausted by her own prophetic accuracy. Rebecca walked them to the door and kissed James goodnight, soft and sweet and full of promise. Then she bent and kissed Emma's forehead, gentle enough not to wake her. "Drive safe. Always." He carried Emma to the car and buckled her into her seat and drove home through the spring night. In his rearview mirror he could see Rebecca's building getting smaller, the lights of her apartment still visible 23 floors up. He thought about how far he had come from the morning he had walked out of Apex with a cactus and no plan how much had changed, because Rebecca Hayes had decided that truth mattered more than convenience. Have you ever had someone see your value when everyone else overlooked you? Or have you been the person who finally recognized someone's worth? Emma stirred in the back seat. Dad? Yeah, baby. We're going to be okay. All of us. I know. Miss Rebecca loves us. I think you're right. I'm always right. I draw the future. She said it drowsily, half asleep, a statement of fact delivered without ego or doubt. Then she was asleep again, breathing deep and even. James drove through the empty streets thinking about futures drawn with colored pencils, about systems that worked because they were built right, about second chances and chosen families and the particular grace of being seen. He carried Emma inside and put her to bed and stood in her doorway watching her sleep. On the refrigerator held by the moon-shaped magnet, Emma's newest drawing waited to be hung. 4 figures. A family. He took it down and looked at it in the kitchen light, at Sarah's hand on his shoulder, at Rebecca standing beside him, at Emma between them holding both their hands. His daughter had drawn them all into being, had made real what he had been afraid to hope for. He hung the drawing back up and went to bed thinking about tomorrow and the day after that, and all the days lined up ahead of them, unmarked and full of possibility. Outside his window, Chicago settled into its midnight rhythms, the city breathing slow and steady. And somewhere across town, Rebecca Hayes stood at her own window, looking out at the same lake, thinking about the same future, drawing it closer with every breath.